Gibbs.
Mr Chair, and I want to begin by thanking the member for East Lothian for bringing this debate forward. I think in the clamour to get this debate, he was the first one out of the trap, so I thank him for that. And I'm very pleased to take part in this debate, but I wish it wasn't necessary, because these closures, this latest round of closures, have been characterised, and I think we've heard this today said in so many words, they've been characterised by a lack of consultation and an arrogant disregard for the majority shareholders involved, i.e. the taxpayer and the consumer. And I find myself, Mr Chair, in the most unusual position, and I hope it happens many times in the future, but the most unusual position of agreeing with the honourable member for Stirling, because he is absolutely correct when he says that these closures will have a disproportionate effect and impact on some of the most vulnerable members of our communities. And this debate, of course, is very timely, because we've heard in Scotland another 62 branch closures announced. And we know that, of course, the RBS vowed in the distant past to not be the last bank, to not close the last bank in town. But it seems that the PR experts that came up with this for RBS have now been completely disregarded, because the bank, of course, is rather ashamed of having made that vow. There has been no consultation, and we've heard from the member from East Lothian, there's been a tick-box mentality as these banks shut up shop and turn their backs on our towns without a backwards glance. And we've heard that 13 communities in Scotland will be left without a bank at all following these recent announcements. But it really is incumbent on me as the member for North Ayrshire and Arran to point out that in my constituency, these latest round of closures bring the number of towns without a bank up to 7. The towns of Dalry, Stevenston, West Kilbride, Ardrossan and Beath no longer have a bank, and now to that list we can add Kilbirnie and Kilwinning. And I honestly don't think, Mr Chair, that any constituency in the UK has been hit so hard or so cruelly. Indeed, the banks are stampeding out of Ayrshire at an alarming, a staggering rate, and of course RBS is leading the way. I cannot overstate, and we've heard it today, I cannot overstate the sense of anger, the sense of betrayal felt by the communities affected right across the United Kingdom. From a bank which has been bailed out by the taxpayer to secure its survival. And Mr Chair, let's not forget, the reason why its survival was under threat was because of its own mismanagement and its own incompetence. And we, the taxpayer, stepped up to save this bank. We still own 73% of that bank. So what we've heard today about these closures is a very bitter pill to swallow indeed. And in addition, the UK Government retains all legislative and regulatory powers in terms of financial services. So the UK Government does indeed have the authority to call a halt to these devastating round of closures. And if the UK Government chooses to do this, it means that banks, stakeholders and the UK and Scottish Governments can consider how best to take account of the obligation to banking customers and our communities. And whatever the banks may say, they do have an obligation to our communities. They have a service obligation, they have a financial obligation, and I would argue, Mr Chair, they have a moral obligation. And like the member for Argyll and Bute, I too will be presenting a petition to Parliament on this issue to allow my constituents' voices to be heard. And let's be clear about what these bank closures mean. They mean that the affected communities no longer have access to day-to-day essential banking services. It means that my constituents, Mr Chair, in Kilbirnie, must undertake a round trip of 18.8 miles to access their new so-called local bank, many of them relying on public transport to do so. It means RBS customers in Saltcoats are being directed to the next RBS, which is a round trip of 12.8 miles away, and Kilwinning customers are being asked to undertake a round trip of 6.8 miles to visit their new local branch. And all of this, Mr Chair, is before you even get to the impact on local businesses who are increasingly finding themselves without access to night safes. If local businesses cannot bank their takings at the end of the business day, then they must incur an extra insurance charge for keeping the cash overnight, with all the security implications that creates. And these small businesses are the backbone, the lifeblood of our communities and our economy. Without a local high street bank, their very futures become more precarious as well. Make no mistake, to leave a town with no bank is financial and social exclusion. Mr Chair, I am really fed up hearing that people now bank online and branches are no longer needed. I accept, as everybody in this debate today has accepted, that some people are changing the way they bank, and good luck to them. But many do not bank online for a whole variety of reasons. And we've heard from the member for East Lothian that digital exclusion is quite a significant factor in that. But it's not the only factor. Mr Chair, I do not bank online. I choose not to bank online, and I will not be bullied into banking online by any bank. So we're being bullied and we're being forced to bank online because we're not behaving in the way the banks would like us to do so. To be clear, mobile banks that we constantly get told about by RBS to placate the towns that they're abandoning, these don't assuage customer concerns because the mobile banks are unreliable and they are not DLA compliant. Now, I know that the Prime Minister has said in the Chamber that branch closures are operational matters for the banks, but I really do not think, Mr Chair, that this is good enough as we face what can only be called a high street banking crisis. Banks have shown and are showing increasingly that they have no sense of service to our communities. It's time for the UK Government to establish and enforce a guaranteed minimum level of service provision for essential banking services, which recognises the importance of continued access to banking for our local communities. And I've put it to several banks as they seek to abandon our towns, that an option they might want to look at is to reduce their opening hours. But the fact is, Mr Chair, they want to shed the asset. They want to close up shop without a backward glance. They're not interested in what our towns need. As for the UK Government arguing that these are operational decisions, there is a precedent, and the member for Argyll and Bute set it out for us. There is a precedent for a publicly owned bank seeking government consent as its majority shareholder, with the previous Chancellor, George Osborne, confirming this during his time as Chancellor, because his consent was sought by RBS over the departure of the previous CEO, Stephen Hester. This means that the UK Government right now could reject any new RBS branch closures in locations where no appropriate face-to-face alternatives are in place, and should require RBS to ensure that practical and sustainable alternative banking services are put in place before any closures are signed off. Otherwise, the road we are going down, Mr Chair, will lead to the very end of high street banking itself. The UK Government has both the legislative and regulatory power and responsibility for banking and financial services, and it is now time, given that banks are riding roughshod over communities with no sense of service or responsibility for leaving customers high and dry, for a guaranteed minimum level of service provision for essential banking services to be put in place. And I urge the Minister to listen very carefully to the very real anger and sense of betrayal these closures have given rise to, and use all the means at his disposal to have these decisions revisited. Otherwise, every high street bank remaining will not remain for much longer.
Yeah.